Welcome to Christ Life Today, where we explore the glorious realities of life in Jesus Christ.
T.U.L.I.P is an acronym that summarizes the Reformed or Calvinistic theology. T is for the total depravity of man, U is unconditional election, L is limited atonement, I is irresistible grace, and P is for the perseverance of the saints. We will be looking at the second letter of the T.U.L.I.P acronym, which is the U, and it stands for unconditional election. What is the unconditional election doctrine speaking of? This doctrine teaches that God has chosen people to be saved from all eternity past, and that God made his choices based on nothing. No conditions or criteria were met for God to elect some people to salvation and others to damnation. The doctrine of election is certainly biblical. There are many scriptures that speak of God's elect, God's election. One example, 1 Thessalonians 1:4, knowing, brethren, beloved, your election of God. The wrong question is, does God choose or elect some people for salvation and others not? The correct question is God's election or choosing of people without any conditions? Scripture clearly tells us that there is a condition, at least one, for God's election. 1 Peter 1:2 tells us, elect according to the foreknowledge of God the Father. So we know from Scripture that election has at least one condition that must be met. God's election is according to his own foreknowledge. The problem to resolve is, does God foreknow or does he foreordain? Reformed theology at times uses foreknew as the same thing as foreordained. As we saw in 1 Peter 1:2, God's condition of election is foreknowledge, not foreordination. Foreknowledge is to know something in advance. Foreordination is to force something to happen. So the question then becomes, what does God foreknow? Interestingly, Scripture pretty clearly tells us what God foreknows, and this is the condition of his election. John 6:64 through 65 are critical verses to understanding God's foreknowledge. It says, but there are some of you, Jesus speaking, but there are some of you who do not believe. For Jesus knew from the beginning who those were who did not believe, and who it was who would betray him. And he said, this is why I told you that no one can come to me unless it is granted him by the Father. Again, that's John 6:64 and 65. So some observations. What is it that God foreknows? Jesus tells us he knew from the beginning who did not believe. And this foreknowledge is the condition of why God grants some people to come to Jesus and others not. Simply stated, God foreknew who would respond in faith to the power of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and based his election on this foreknowledge. God knows that the gospel of Jesus Christ is his power to salvation, and Jesus knew from the beginning who did not believe it. And it's based on this. He says, this is why I told you, no one can come to me unless it is granted him by the Father. So the next time you want to know what it is that God foreknows, it's the response to the gospel. It's who did and did not believe, or who would and would not believe in Jesus Christ. The final decision, what this question boils down to is, does God choose people for salvation based on nothing, or does God choose people for salvation based on his foreknowledge of their response to the gospel? The debate hinges on the sovereignty of God. Which doctrine presents a more sovereign God? God is more powerful than people, and he forces his will based on his brute force. Or God is so sovereign that he accomplishes his will without forcing it on humanity. God is far more sovereign than simply bullying people to get his way. God's election according to Scripture is based on his foreknowledge. And according to Scripture, he knew from the beginning who did not believe and who did believe. He didn't force them not to believe or to believe. He knew who did. And so our conclusion is that God is far more sovereign, accomplishing his will without usurping humanity's free will.